I'm also talking about energy performance certificates, but from a slightly different perspective. And coming from a health researcher possible point of view, why energy performance certificates? Well, partly to increase the information available to prospective owners and tenants to a building to allow them to value the building appropriately and decide whether or not they want to live there. And also to give us a national common language beyond the building meets code or it doesn't meet code, as if meeting code is anything to be proud of, except sadly it is. Meeting code should be the baseline standard above which we aspire for. Having energy performance certificates would encourage developers to build buildings above code because there was a way of valuing that above codeness. It would encourage owners to retrofit properties either for themselves or for their tenants because they had a way of showing, yes, this is worthwhile. And it would also more easily allow future regulation of rental properties, as happens overseas, I think especially in Britain, where they've said that properties cannot be rented if they're at a level G or maybe it is F in their energy performance certificates. They're not allowed to be rented. They're not of sufficient quality. And having energy performance certificates would allow all these things to begin to happen in New Zealand. Many other countries have them, as Roman has just described. And in the last election, both Labour and the Greens mentioned energy performance certificates in their pre-election plans. So this is a time to really think about them and what we want them to be, because there is a chance of getting some political traction for them happening. And also, as Elrond was talking earlier, MB is running its transitional carbon frameworks, which for the new buildings included that calculation of thermal energy requirements, which, if there is political will, could be turned into an energy performance certificate, if we decide we want it. So the anatomy of an energy performance certificate, we take a measure of energy use, we divide it by a measure of the value of the space, and transform it in some way onto a scale, which we then tell people about. The measure of energy use is often an estimate of annual energy use under quite standard conditions, as Roman was just describing. This is really technical, and it's really important. And there are piles of assumptions, and you can consider your weather files for the last 10 years and decide how you integrate over them, and lots of detail that's very important to get right. Then you decide how you measure, you value your space, you decide how to decide whether your 2-bedroom, 75 square metre house compares to a 3-bedroom, 200 square metre house, and what kind of metric it's appropriate to compare them with. And then you transform them onto a scale. The scale is pretty, it's interpretive, it's the bit that Roman was just talking about, and it's important to get this right, it's important to get the interpretation easy for people to understand. But what I'm talking about right now for the rest of this presentation is the measure of the value of space, how to decide how we compare things, and what two things are equivalent when we're deciding how much energy is too much energy. So lots of countries use area as the basis on which the certificates take place, and on that document that we saw earlier from MB, there's a whole pile of per square metres in their calculations, which I've highlighted there. For the water use, they've got a per person. And what I'm wanting to suggest, as well as considering maybe per square metre usage, what would it look like for our residential dwellings if we used a per person? If we said, what we care about with dwellings is how many people they can safely look after. And so it makes more sense, possibly, to look at our energy certificates on a per-person basis than just how large is your house basis. So if we're looking at area-based methods, if we're just using direct normalization, we take our measure of heat loss that's had the immense $10 million calculations go into it that Roman was describing, and we divide it by floor area, and that gives our direct calculation. In the UK, for the SAP, they divide by the floor area plus 45 square metres. In one of the many US systems, they divide the heat loss by an estimate of the heat loss from the same dwelling if it had a standardized glazing regime, because, yeah. And in one of the Australian systems, they take the same heat loss per floor area thing and do something, and multiply it by a correction factor involving the heat loss for a square house of 200 square meters, and then the heat loss of the same house if it had standard glazing and was square and was the same size. So, there's different ways of doing this. But if we're looking at a house and thinking about people, how many people can live in a house? How many people could live in this house? This is a fairly standard modernish design, 3 bedrooms with an open plan living kitchen area. Is the usefulness of the space defined by the number of square meters or the way the space is divided up? Now, depending on how, I'm an academic, it depends on how you count. It all depends on how you count. By my calculations, this house can hold somewhere between 4 and 11 people. Depends how you count. If you look at the cultural aspirational, 2 people in the master bedroom, 1 in each of the others, we get 4. If we say CNOS, which is the Canadian National Occupancy Standard, which is basically allows no more than 2 people per bedroom, we could say either 6 with 2 in each of those bedrooms, or maybe 8 if we reassign the study as a bedroom. If we look at our actual New Zealand laws, the 1947 Housing Improvement Regulations, which define people by the floor area of bedrooms, would say this master is actually humongous. Maybe it could sleep 4 people. And we could allow in 2 in each of the bedrooms and 1 in the study because it's quite small, so maybe 9 people. If we say, hey, maybe we should really cap the number of people per bathroom or toilet at 7, then that would, and also apply CNOS, that brings it down to 7 people in this house. And then if we say, let's repurpose the second living space, media rumpus room, to be a bedroom, that with all those other criteria, it brings up to 9. So it depends on how you count enormously. And just to help you think through things later on, I'm going to put up a graphic of this with how many people this particular house might count under different methods. So what I've done is taken a look at 87 house plans that someone at some point thought was possible to build in New Zealand. 2 of them are tiny houses, 23 estate house plans from the 40s to 1960s, and there were 62 modern houses. They were chosen to be a wide variety of sizes, and have done some really simple measurements to consider both potential occupancy and potential heat loss, and done some really simple thermal modelling. But despite the era the houses were designed in, I've considered the heat loss all if it was built to the current 2009 standard. So I've got a whole pile of graphs that look like this. What we've got is the dwelling size along the bottom, and some measure of energy loss rate up the y-axis. Because we've got 87 dwellings and they're all the same, the house, each plan is going to appear at the same place across the x-axis, but jump up and down the y-axis depending on how it counts under that particular measure. This one we're looking at right now is just the absolute energy loss rate, so it's amount of energy being lost per degree temperature difference between indoors and outdoors. And also in all of these graphs, half the dots are in green and half are in blue. The half that are in green are the houses that are in the best half under that particular definition, and the ones in blue are in the worst half. So if we just look at the amount of energy lost from these houses, it's better to be small. Smaller houses lose less energy generally. There's a bit of wibble around the 130 square metre mark where some count as best and some count as worst depending on the exact conformation of the house. But overall, smaller is better. Smaller saves energy. If next we look at the direct normalization, so we just divide the house size, the heat loss by the area of the house, as is standard in, I think was pretty much implied in the MB framework, this is what happens. It's better to be big, which to my thinking, it's daft. Technical term, daft. Some large houses perform exceptionally badly, but overall they perform much better. The two tiny houses I've got there perform exceptionally badly under this definition. If we look at normalization, under the UK definition. So you can see this is why they included their 45 square meters in their SAP normalization, because it evens out that that curve we had there. It makes it much flatter. So it's they basically included a fudge factor to make it look not so awful and to make the smaller houses somewhat. Thank you. To make the smaller houses not look quite so bad under the scheme, but it certainly doesn't reward houses for being small. If we look at the US rescale, it says nothing about house size, which is not surprising considering it only cared about glazing. But again, if we were doing this in New Zealand, do we actually want to reward large houses, or do we want to not care about house size? The Australian rescale has actually got something going on there. If houses are going to succeed under this method, they have to be not huge, but they can, the two tiny houses again perform badly. If we look at the cultural aspirational scale, you certainly don't succeed well if you've got a large house, but small houses don't necessarily perform, or smallish houses don't necessarily perform well either. CNOS scale, again, we can, there's things going on here. 2 people per bedroom, that seems workable. And the 1947 regulations in the various rescales, again, smaller houses aren't doing particularly well here because we reward large bedrooms under them. And if we include CNOS, then it gets a little bit worse. The tiny houses perform particularly badly under this, the 1947 regulations, because they were so small, the bedrooms could only fit one person. So, 87 sets of plans. In all these plans, there was only one house that was in the best half of all the houses. One, if we were saying each of these were a cap, there was one house that each of those definitions would have allowed to be built, and there was one house that each of those definitions would have not allowed to be built. All of the definitions. Everything else is somewhere in between. Everything else, it depends on how you count. If just looking at the final 8 parameterizations, which weren't either just the amount of energy or the direct normalization, there were 4 always in the worst half and 6 always in the best half, and others in the middle. It depends how you count. So the method of normalization really matters. And that's the take-home message from this presentation. If we're going for an energy performance certificate in New Zealand, we have the opportunity to get this right because we have waited past the time other countries have waited, which is a problem in itself, but let's get it right. Large houses tend to use more energy. It doesn't make sense to reward a house for being large. Not only do they use more operational energy, obviously there's more embodied energy built in them. Rewarding it does not make sense. We have to decide what it is we actually want our dwellings to do. Do we want them to house large numbers of... We want dwellings that are able to house large numbers of people if we need to house large numbers of people. We have some families that are large, and we want our 10-people extended families to be able to live healthily and appropriately in their houses. So we need to have a metric that does allow for a house that's big when it needs to be big, but it cannot, in my opinion, encourage a house to be big. The method of normalization matters enormously. From my take-home message from this, thinking about it, is I quite like the Australian method, which was just based on size, but included specific factors to control for both the form, the shape of the house, and for the area. And or one that's based on a thoughtful occupancy, considering what it is we want a house to do. And to me, a thoughtful occupancy would be no more than 2 people per bedroom, and including a cap on the number of people per toilet, probably at fewer than the 7 that I've used in those calculations because it appeared in the 1947 regulations somewhere, so I went with it. But I think 7 people sharing a toilet feels a bit much to me. But unfortunately, in all the different methods I've looked at for defining crowdedness, people per toilet isn't one that's actually been measured very often, so I wasn't able to come up with something more vigorous. And that's it. I tried to go fast.